Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third week of our Bible study on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, faith in a time of trial. This week we'll be looking at chapter 2, verse 17 through chapter 3, verse 10. And the reason we've decided to break it up this way is because Paul makes a pretty significant transition between verse 16 and 17 in chapter 2, and again between verses 10 and 11 in chapter 3. So we'll look at the majority of chapter 3 this week, and then we'll move on to the majority of chapter 4 next week. So as Paul does in other letters, Paul writes this letter, especially these first few chapters, these first 3 chapters, with a tone of friendship. In the ancient world, friendship was seen as being transactional. It was all about what two individuals could do for or could give to each other. But Paul turns this idea of friendship around in this letter by making the point that he wants to have a friendship with the Thessalonians that is based on mutual love and respect, and not what the two sides can do for each other. So as we go through this chapter especially, we'll see a lot of this language of love and affection that Paul has for the Thessalonians, even though he is apart from them. In this section of his letter, Paul says that he longs to be with the Thessalonians, but that there has been something blocking his way. So he has sent Timothy to check in with the Thessalonians and report back to Paul. Now Paul says Timothy has reported back, and he is overjoyed to hear about all the good things that is happening with the Thessalonians. As Paul does when he wants to mark a transition, especially in this letter, Paul addresses the brothers to which he is writing his letter. So he starts out in verse 17, "As for you, brothers and sisters, when for a short time we were made orphans by being separated from you in person, not in heart, we longed with great eagerness to see you face to face. For we wanted to come to you, certainly I, Paul, wanted to again and again, but Satan blocked our way. For what is our hope or joy or crown of boasting before our Lord at his coming? Is it not you? Yes, you are our glory and joy." So the NRSV has decided to translate the Greek word adelphoi as brothers and sisters, seeking to be more inclusive, but the word adelphoi means brothers. And the reason that Paul uses this term specifically is because, as you may recall, we talked about in the first week that Paul was writing to a group of artisans who had formed a church together and who Paul had joined as a tent maker. And at that time, guilds were all male, meaning that assuming Paul was writing to other members of the guild he had joined as an artisan and a tent maker, he would have been addressing an all-male audience. So that's why Paul uses the word adelphoi, uses the word brothers, and it's just a more modern translation that we've got the more inclusive brothers and sisters. Paul notes that although he is physically separated from the Thessalonians, his heart is not separated from them. I think we can all certainly relate to that right now. During this pandemic, there have been people that we have been physically separated from, but whom we still have great love and affection for. So with these words, Paul reminds us that although we may be physically separated from people, no amount of distance can separate us from the love we share with others. Now, Paul refers to himself and his associates as orphans. Now, the Greek word that is translated as orphan is aporhav isthenes, which I'm sure I messed up. But it means that literally means one who is torn away. So this is the only time that this word is used in the New Testament, and it can mean anyone who has been separated from a loved one. So by Paul using this metaphor of a child who has lost their parents, we gain a fuller understanding of the depth of love and affection Paul has for the Thessalonians. It's not just Paul writes with a tone of friendship, but it's more than friendship. He appreciates the Thessalonians and has so much love for them that he compares himself to an orphan that has lost his or her parents. So we don't know exactly what was preventing Paul from traveling to Thessalonica. Paul just says that Satan has blocked their way. And New Testament scholar Walter Wink suggests that Paul is referring to larger forces beyond specific individuals, and that Paul is being opposed by institutions, systems, or ideologies that are preventing him from traveling to see the Thessalonians. If this is true, it would be consistent with the persecution and opposition Paul faced in some of the places that he visited, as we hear about specifically more in Acts. So in the first few verses of chapter 3, as we transition from the end of chapter 2 to verse 3, Paul refers to Timothy as his co-worker. It should be noted that though there are versions of this text that use the Greek word diakonon, which is servant, to refer to Timothy. But Paul here refers to Timothy either as a servant or a co-worker. There's another set of manuscripts that use the Greek word for co-worker. And so we're not exactly sure what Paul meant, whether he meant that to call Timothy his co-worker, as the NRSV has it translated, or as a servant. But regardless of which word that we use, the bottom line is that Timothy is a companion of Paul, who Paul has sent to the Thessalonians to send back an update on the community. So Paul's chief concern in this first section of chapter 3 seems to be the persecution the Thessalonians have apparently experienced because of their faith. Paul says that he has sent Timothy to be with them so that he could strengthen and encourage the Thessalonians so their faith would not be shaken by the persecution they have faced. Paul even reminds them that he and his associates had warned them that they were going to face persecution for their faith. So Paul's concern here also seems to be that of a friend, maybe one who even felt a little guilty for getting the Thessalonians in this mess of persecution in the first place. And even though he had tried to warn them that persecution would happen, it would seem that Paul still feels guilty for having had the Thessalonians have to go through these difficult times. So what Paul is doing here is very important to communities that are facing persecution. He is reminding them that they are not alone. They may have experienced physical persecution as well as the persecution that comes from following a different path than your friends and neighbors. But Paul reminds them that they are not alone. Paul and his associates and Timothy and other people are going through the same things they are going through. And so part of Paul's purpose for writing this letter is to let the Thessalonians know that they are not alone in their suffering. Paul ends this section of the letter up through verse 10. We're looking more at verses 6 through 10 here of chapter 3. Paul ends this section with what we are considering today by again giving thanks to the Thessalonians. Here Paul is thankful that despite the persecution they have faced, they have kept their faith and still have affection for him, even though he was sort of the one that got them all invested in this new religion that has led to their persecution. It apparently has not diminished their affection or their respect for Paul. And so Paul is very thankful that despite this persecution, they still have love and affection for him. Throughout this letter, Paul has used a tone of friendship. It's been suggested that Paul wrote using this tone so that when he gets to the ethical considerations that are coming up that we'll look at in chapters 4, 5, and 6, in 4 and 5, that it will be seen as coming from, as words coming from a friend, and that these suggestions or rules that Paul is laying down for how to behave and for the ethical considerations that he wants the Thessalonians to consider, that they will see these as suggestions or rules coming from a friend and not a strict disciplinarian. And so that takes us up to chapter 4, which we'll pick up on next week, or I should say the end of chapter 3, which we'll pick up on next week, and we'll consider the last couple of verses of chapter 3 and then move on to chapter 4. So the questions for reflection this week are, how does knowing that Paul is writing to an all-male audience affect how you interpret this text? Do you agree with Walter Wink's assessment that it was larger forces, such as institutions, systems, and ideologies, that prevented Paul from traveling to see the Thessalonians? Why or why not? Paul responds to the separation between him and the Thessalonians by writing a letter. So how have you responded during this time of pandemic to people from whom you have been separated? What purpose do you think Paul has for using a tone of friendship in this letter? And finally, where do you find hope in chapter 3 of 1 Thessalonians? So that is all for this week, and I hope you'll be able to enjoy it and join us next week as we consider the end of chapter 3 and chapter 4.